Welcome to a brand new episode and a brand new season of Starts at the Top, our podcast about leading differently. Our mission is to help leaders and their teams understand what they need to do differently today to prepare for the world of tomorrow. I'm Zoe Amma.
And I'm Paul Thomas. We started Starts at the Top as a podcast about digital disruption. But over the last few years, our guests have shown us something more important and urgent, that how traditional ways of leading have changed forever. Our mission is to speak to leaders who are carving out new ways of leading, covering topics from emerging tech to inclusion, from remote work to mental health and resilience, and from climate change to AI. If it's about the state of leadership in 2026, it will be on our podcast.
We're not here for the shiny corporate case studies. We share stories from leaders who have learned lessons and made progress the hard way, navigating complexity and providing inspiration across every sector.
And the complexity that leaders are facing has only intensified. And Zoe, you shared a link to a new report from the Alliance Manchester Business School today called Navigating Unprecedented Change that finds that almost 3/4 of senior leaders say their roles have become more complex since 2020, driven by AI, new regulation, economic turbulence, culture change, and hybrid work. And over half say that it's making core tasks like growth, transformation, and talent retention even harder. It's almost like this report has set up our manifesto for this season of the podcast.
Yes, absolutely. So I saw this pop up on my LinkedIn feed today. So we're recording on the evening of Monday, the 20th of April. And this report just felt like it was right up our street. So I had a read through it today. So it's really interesting. It's talking about all the additional pressures that there are on leaders. And we've heard a lot about this as part of our work on this podcast and also in our day jobs as well over the last few years. And this report from University of Manchester Business School is well worth reading. It's really, really interesting. And it talks about the complexity crisis in UK leadership, specifically amongst business leaders. So I'd be really interested to hear about how charity sector leaders and public sector leaders are tackling similar issues. I suspect the results would be quite similar based on the work that we do. But it's a really fascinating one because it talks about this gap between big and long term ambitions, but also the day to day reality loop that leaders are caught up in, which is essentially almost continuous firefighting and trying to continuously get to grips with how the world is changing, how their organization needs to respond to that. And of course, all these big forces at work now, such as the political and economic climate and all the change that's happening there and all the disruption. And of course, AI led change as well. And all of this is a bit of a recipe for burnout in many ways. So the report talks about how many leaders are burning out or quietly stepping back from leadership altogether. And I do know leaders who've had to take some time out from leading because the demands have just been too intense. So this feels like a report very much for our times, and we would love to hear from our listeners about how they are dealing with these issues and whether it resonates with them.
Yeah, and a topic that we should break down and a report that we should break down over the weeks and episodes of this season. Just reflecting on some of the work that I'm doing at the moment, thinking back to when organizations set 5-year strategies, and now it feels like even looking 5 weeks ahead is problematic. So yeah, it's the changing pace and the changing time frame for leaders and leadership and decision making is quite changed. And I think we'll come back to that point about the pressure on leaders when we talk about our guest, Dr. Mark Williamson, who's the author of a new book called Make Life Happier. But perhaps, I guess, since COVID, it seems that the stakes keep rising and rising. It feels like conditions for leadership have been reset. And I'm sure it's no different for you, but the leaders that we're working with are juggling huge economic challenges, unprecedented regulatory change, growing AI disruption, plus add to that the sheer speed of our 4/7 media cycle and social media. Many of them are doing that while feeling undertrained, undersupported, and more stressed than they were 5 years ago. It's certainly a maelstrom.
It really is. And do you remember how back in the early days of lockdown, everyone used to open all their emails by saying, I hope you're doing okay in these unprecedented times. I hope you're doing okay in these
Mm.
strange times. Well, it really does feel like we actually are in unprecedented times now
Until the
because
next unprecedented time. Yeah.
yes, exactly, because there's a war, there's economic upheaval, there's AI, there's climate change, there's everything. Everything is a challenge. Obviously, there are opportunities within that as well. And we talk about this on our podcast too. But you're right. I think leadership is a challenge. And it's also it's kind of a bar that we all have to feel we need to keep rising and growing to meet. And some of that is a good thing, but some of it is also a real challenge because, as you say, no one's really been trained for the times that we're in, right? So I guess it's really about
Mm.
adapting your skill set and developing your skill set almost continuously so you can meet all of these demands coming at all of us from so many different directions.
Yeah, and I think it's all of the regulatory changes as well that come along with that, particularly with the AI driven change. It's something that we're trying to keep up with ourselves as consultants, let alone if you're running a business that's being affected by all of this. It's going to be a huge challenge for the next few years.
I think if you're developing any kind of strategy in the current climate, you have to build a lot of caveats into it, not in such a way that you're hedging your bets, but certainly with the strategies that we're developing in digital and AI, we're building in more time for review. We're saying to clients, you have to introduce these checkpoints because even 3 months from now, we'll see all of these quantum leaps in the technology. And you need some contingency time and, frankly, also some contingency resource to deal with that and also to review the roadmap which you've put in place as well. And again, I do think that's quite a burden for leaders because they're having to map the terrain whilst they're simultaneously traversing it, and that's quite a big ask of anyone. The regulatory side of things, I know we were going to talk about this as well, and obviously there's a lot of things going on here, not least some huge questions about governance in the wake of the news story that is the gift that keeps on giving, Anthropic's release of the Mythos model, supposedly unprecedented, again using that word, model which can expose cybersecurity vulnerabilities in all kinds of software. And I think that's got lots of people talking about governance and regulation. So that meant that I was absolutely intrigued by this story from the UK government's move to extend the Online Safety Act so that government can respond faster to AI driven harms. We've obviously covered the Online Safety Act previously with two of our guests in the last season, Chris Sherwood from NSPCC and also Maeve Walsh from the Online Safety Network. And this is, again, is a story that bubbled up a few weeks ago, but I heard being covered on the Today programme on the day of our record. So I thought it was worth coming back to in case anyone hadn't come across it. So what government's looking to do is to extend the Online Safety Act so government can respond faster to AI-driven harms. I suspect part of this is coming about because of the Grok story about harmful images being created and making sure that you've got the regulatory framework in place to deal with that. So this is very much about responding to illegal AI generated content, but also looking at some of the provisions which may be extended in relation to chatbots and young people having access to those. So it's very much a sign of how the regulation is really having to adapt this shifting landscape and how, again, that's a really hard ask of regulation because it's having to regulate for something where the shape of it isn't fully clear yet.
Totally. In the accounting world, professional services world, we've seen the UK audit watchdog, the FRC, issue the world's first guidance on using generative and agentic AI in the audit process. You and I talked about this, and it's funny, I've got a contact at the FRC who I talked about the latest season of Industry, which was quite focused on this world, quite apart from everything else that it was focused on. This was a big part of the program, but they've effectively given a green light for firms to lean into these tools, but with a very clear message that human auditors are still responsible for the quality of the audit process and outcomes. And I think this poses quite an interesting question for the profession about whether this helps to supercharge the big four firms who have the money, the tech and the teams to be able to respond to the guidance and to say, yes, we're here and we're ready, and risks leaving the mid-tier firms that I tend to work with behind because they don't have the investment. And that's why so many of these organizations, so many of these firms are leaning towards private equity money because they can't afford to keep up with what everyone else is doing. And at the end of the day, I think the big losers in all of this will be UK businesses. Will lose out on having the best audit experience from their providers. So there's really got to be something done quite radically in that space to look at how they start to close the gap. So, yeah, for leaders who already think the world is moving quite fast, it's a lot.
It is a lot, yes. And I think what makes it harder for developments to the Online Safety Act, but also for any individual regulators who are having to, and membership bodies as well, actually, who are having to create
Mm.
guidance. What's quite hard is that obviously we've got a very limited AI regulation in the UK at the moment. Obviously, there's things which are being bolted on to
Yeah.
other parts of regulation, like the Online Safety Act in this instance. But I would imagine, and bearing in mind I'm not a policymaker, that if you don't have this central scaffolding of national regulation about AI, and we don't know when that is coming. I believe the government has said it will happen at some point, but we know there's an AI bill at the moment, isn't there, going through House of
Hmm.
Lords. Then it's much harder, isn't it? Because you're having to kind of build the wheel, reinvent the wheel, whatever those cliches are. And it's harder when there isn't a central regulatory approach. So yes, it's certainly tricky times if you're trying to create regulation, create policy, but nevertheless also interesting ones as well.
Interesting times. Yeah, I
Mm.
think you see that in the market all the time. Everyone's trying to release a report on AI best practice, and sometimes it's hard to see the wood from the trees in terms of what's coming out into the market that everyone needs to pay attention to. As you said, each of the industry bodies has their own say. What I think I'd like to see more of, and going back to the ethos of this podcast, is them working together to come up with plans that work across the board. So you're not having to sort of force people into going down several routes at a time, which is why I think someone like the FRC, which that professional services world, the auditing world, will be paying attention to as the regulator, I think is really, really, really important.
Yeah, definitely. Well, maybe we'll see something about those those rules in the next season of Industry. Who knows? I'd imagine it'll be one of the less fruity plot lines, but intriguing nevertheless. So we talked about quite a lot of gloomy stuff in the intro today, but now to something happier. And we're delighted that in this opening episode of our new season, we are talking to Dr. Mark Williamson about his new book, Make Life Happier 23 Practical Ways to Feel Better, Find Meaning, and Make a Difference. And Paul, you had a really nice idea about how we should check in with each other more. And this book is also an opportunity to have that discussion. So I think that's a great point about how, in a world of many challenges, always on tech and accelerating AI, how are we challenging ourselves to be more human, to be calmer, to be more connected and happier, rather than just becoming more productive, but busier, overstimulated, and perhaps burnt out as well?
Yeah, and the danger there of almost sounding like a Radiohead lyric, having listened to a lot of Radiohead recently, how right they were about the way things were going to go way back in 1997 when they did OK Computer. Yeah, and I think without the intentional effort not to do so, I think it can feel like we do live a lot of our lives on autopilot. So I wanted this season of the podcast to help us explore some of the ways that people are intentionally switching off and finding ways to refocus.
Yes, absolutely. We've got some great content coming up about that. Lots of great guests to talk to alongside all of the usual stuff about AI and how leadership is changing. And I think you're absolutely right, Paul. It's so easy to slip into that habit of just scrolling, constant notifications. But what does it take in this day and age to reclaim our focus as leaders, business owners, and parents as well? And I really like the fact that in the episode, Mark talks about anxiety, but he also talks about active hope as well, which is how we stay hopeful and intentional in the middle of constant change, constant tech headlines, and worrying noise around world events. So we'll aim as part of this season to connect some of these very human questions to bigger system level changes, especially those affecting civil society.
All of which leads us very nicely to today's conversation, which feels incredibly timely. In this episode, we're talking to Dr. Mark Williamson, author of Make Life Happier. Mark's work focuses on how we can build happier lives from the inside out through attention, mindset, relationships, and everyday practices, rather than chasing happiness as another item on the to do list.
In this episode, we talked to Mark about how leaders can stay grounded and hopeful in a complexity crisis, ways all of us can avoid living on autopilot in an AI shaped world, and what practical habits we can build to feel calmer and more connected at work, at home, and online.
So, whether you're listening on the commute, or on a walk between meetings, or hiding from your inbox for half an hour, this one's for you. Here's our conversation with Dr. Mark Williamson.
We are absolutely delighted to be joined by Dr. Mark Williamson on Starts at the Top today. Happiness engineer, and what a wonderful title that is, Dr. Mark Williamson is co founder and director of Action for Happiness, the world's largest non commercial community promoting well-being. He has taken Action for Happiness from a concept in 2010 to a thriving global mass movement with over 600,000 members across more than 100 countries. He is also the author of a wonderful new book, which we're going to be talking about today, Make Life Happier: 23 Practical Ways to Feel Better, Find Meaning, and Make a Difference. And I can say from my own experience that I've been reading the book and it really has made my life happier. Prior to Action for Happiness, Mark's experience ranged across commercial and non-profit organisations, from startups to large multinationals. He was Director of Innovation at the Carbon Trust and founder of online initiative What You Can Do. He spent 9 years as a management consultant at Accenture and also worked for Hewlett Packard Labs and Orange. He has an MBA from IMD Business School in Switzerland, where he received the President's Award, and a PhD and first class honours degree in engineering from the University of Bristol. He is a member of the Institute of Directors, a Sainsbury Management Fellow, Chartered Engineer, Fellow of the RSA as well. In 2010, Mark gave up the corporate world and changed direction to focus on happiness and well-being. And in 2022, he was awarded an additional honorary doctorate in recognition of his work with Action for Happiness. Mark, what an uplifting biography with so many achievements. It's so lovely to have you on Starts at the Top. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much for inviting me. Gosh, I haven't heard that bio at that length before, for at least for quite a while. Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here talking about a topic that I'm very passionate about, but I think actually matters to all of us in our lives, whether we're leaders or just general human beings trying to make the most of this one precious life we have.
Thank you, Mark. We're absolutely delighted to have you here. It was like a ray of sunshine in our inbox when we started talking to you and your team and heard about your fantastic book. And as we were saying just before the recording started, we think this book is so timely and important because we have so many leaders listening to this podcast. And we know that everyone has had so much on their shoulders over the last few years, whether it's the pandemic, whether it's dealing with the ongoing political and economic volatility. And ironically, many of the leaders that we speak to, they're so focused on the well-being of their staff and developing positive mindsets across their teams, but perhaps don't have the time to think about their own happiness or well-being, which is very much where your book comes in. And we know that you have some lived experience of making that journey yourself. So in your bio, we talked about how you moved across from the corporate world to focusing on a career in happiness and well-being through your work now. Can you tell us a bit about that change and what led you to make that change?
Well, thank you. As you mentioned, I refer to myself now as a happiness engineer. I was originally an engineer and scientist by background, and I guess I've always loved problem solving and took those skills into corporate life and spent about a decade as a management consultant, helping various types of companies, lots of financial services companies, improve, make changes, build technology, roll out huge things. I found the problem solving part of it motivating and the managing teams. But with real honesty, I didn't find that the sort of culture was something that sustained me. And in fact, with hindsight, I had I was very close to some kind of serious breakdown because I was working in a context where it didn't feel as meaningful as I have moved on to find since. And I realized actually with hindsight that I'd spent most of my life to that point running up a ladder of trying to meet other people's expectations, whether that's pleasing parents, doing well at school, striving up a ladder without really checking what building the ladder's leaning against. And so outwardly I was seen as successful, and inwardly I was really lost. I was struggling. And actually, it wasn't coming out emotionally because as well as really caring what people thought about me, I also didn't really talk about my emotions very much. And so it was coming out in my case as physical pain. I had a really severe back pain issue, which
Mm.
actually is where this new book starts. And that was the first of many wake up calls to sort of realize that my life was out of balance. And I learned at the time something we now call mindfulness, but to me was just a sort of breathing exercise to sort of disconnect, well, reconnect actually with my body and notice how I was feeling. And I found that this pain that had left me unable to get out of bed and really worried about my future health, I was able to sort of move from being almost unable to move to being restored again by allowing that awareness to grow. So I realized not only was I in physical pain, I was emotionally struggling, mentally struggling. And that was the beginning of a change in sort of mindset that allowed me to wake up a bit to the fact that maybe I could use my skills and passion in a different direction. I ended up working in another topic I find real passion of mine, the world of environmental issues. And having done my MBA, went off and worked for the Carbon Trust for a while. But all along that journey was this sort of nagging question about what really does make for a happy life. I've learned, I think, the hard way that it isn't necessarily about an outwardly successful career or indeed the money and other trappings that might come with that. And it does seem to be to do with working on things you care about. That was certainly something I found. But the real question, the spark for me was our whole culture is really built around an unhelpful view of what happiness is. We're told that it's about earning more, accumulating more, having more, and we charge at that without giving ourselves the space to recover, to process, to grow. And for me, the big pivot was saying I would like to give the rest of my journey towards supporting not only my own well-being but bringing ideas like this to many others. So that's a rather long answer to your question, but it led to me leaving corporate life and actually setting up now 15 years ago this charity, Action for Happiness, which was an idea that has now blossomed, but it has been a personal journey as much as a sort of social movement for me. And I would love as many people as possible to experience what I have. I'm certainly not living a perfect life or fully happy all the time, but the transition from stressed and lacking in meaning to sometimes stressed, but feeling purposeful and actually having a much better overall sense of well-being has been the most life-changing thing.
And isn't that a wonderful sliding doors moment? Because I really felt when I was reading that chapter in the book, all the turmoil that goes from making that kind of life transition, but having that awareness around, I really need to listen to what my instincts are telling me around why well-being is important and why self-care is so important as well. That feels like it was fundamentally really, really transformative for you. And if there are any leaders out there listening now where they're thinking, feel like something's not quite right and I need to make a change, what would you say to them?
Well, I, with hindsight, feel that I had a sort of good life crisis, which is a phrase I like as a sort of rather more optimistic version of a transition that many of us face at various times in our life journey. And for me, that was perhaps best captured by an exercise I did with a coach I was working with at the time. And we can do this together now, actually. The idea was to imagine yourself, and I did this for myself, towards the end of your life many years from now, looking back on all the highs and lows of your life, your career, the things you've achieved, the things that didn't happen, the highs and lows, if you like, and really keeping that mindset in mind, the sort of future self. The question was very simple. What advice would your future self give you right now about what really matters? And I mean, you can do this as you're listening, but I found that it brought great clarity to me. It was spend more time with the people you really care about, working on the projects that really matter, and let go of caring about what other people think of you and lots of the day-to-day sort of stresses we bring with us, and recognize that that's not as important in the longer term as some of the other directional stuff. And so that was the beginning of that, like, I can and I would like to shift focus. A really tangible exercise that helped me with that, again, it was a sort of humbling activity, but I had the chance to sort of look at, I think it was 18 different factors that contribute to a good life. And it might include your influence, your salary, your professional growth, your personal growth, your contribution to society, your family, your health, your friends, a real mix of sort of professional and personal aims. And the challenge was to rank these things in order. So for me, Mark, and again for you right now listening, what are the things that you would put top of your list overall as your sort of life priorities? And maybe what are some of the ones you'd let go? And I found myself saying, oh, well, clearly it's my family first, and then it's my contribution to society, and then it's my growth, personal growth, and then it's my spouse, or whatever it was at the time. And I felt quite proud of my list. And then the challenge was, imagine a private detective has been following your life for the last few years. What would they say your priorities are? And that was where I sort of had almost, a sharp intake of breath to realize that the way I'd been living was, you know, to all intents and purposes, prioritizing professional growth and income and status and prestige and influence. And actually, those other things that I claimed to care about my relationships, about my contribution, they were actually in practice not getting anywhere near the top of the list. So there was a real disconnect between my sort of values as I perceived them and the actual reality of my life. And as you were saying at the start, some of that's understandable. Lots of us are dealing with so much, and it's really hard to sort of stay focused on what matters. But I also think many of us are missing opportunities to notice what we could let go of and to choose where we place our energy and attention.
You talk in the book about coming off of autopilot. And what we've just described there is many people go through their life on a kind of autopilot. But you were lucky enough, and the first chapters of the book resonated with me because I had two really bad slip disc issues over the course of 3 years. Oh, God, a long time ago now, over 10 years ago. And that was extremely debilitating and eventually led to me leaving the corporate world as well. And I had that moment, like you did, where you're forced to pause and think, well, how do I get through this? And I had a conversation with an osteopath. He led me to exploring Alexander technique, and I was in control of my body from that point on. And life's been good ever since. Back's been fine ever since. But I think it's that shift, isn't it? Being able to just recognize that moment in your working life where you do take stock, you do step away, you do pause. And how do you influence leaders to be able to make that stop?
I really like that question. I also ended up marrying an osteopath. You mentioned that, which has been helpful. But no, I talk in the book, Make Life Happier, about all kinds of skills to look after our own well-being and to sort of build our relationships and help others. But I talk about one particularly that I think of as a foundation, and it builds on what you've just asked, really. And so some people talk about mindfulness as this sort of ability to be present and pay attention. For others, that might conjure up images of being about meditation and so on. And meditation is a way you can learn the skill of mindfulness, but it isn't necessarily for everyone. And yet, I think this ability to have self awareness, to get off autopilot, is the fundamental life skill from which everything else can build. And so I like to think of this as a bit like a bicep curl for the mind. So 30, 40 years ago, hardly anyone went to the gym. It just wasn't a thing. And yet we all know now, because we've been doing it. I mean, it started initially with sort of military training, but eventually we moved into everybody got the sense that if I go to the gym and do some repeated reps of something, I will build that muscle. I can change my physical body. The same is true of our mental capacities. Every time we are able to get off autopilot and bring our attention back to right here, right now, just noticing how I'm feeling as I'm saying this, looking around me in the room and identifying things, bringing attention to my body and noticing like how I'm sitting, looking at you and seeing the connection we have. In any moment, whether we're traveling or in a meeting or in an argument, we have that choice about where is my attention right now? And that opens up this sort of spotlight of attention on like, oh, how am I feeling? And how's the other person doing right now? And what's the context here and what might I be missing, under the table, beneath the surface of this conversation. It's like a sort of hidden superpower we all have to be more in the moment and more engaged. And so lots of the other things we could talk about, whether it's about sort of realistic optimism or good relationships or forgiveness or coping skills, I think these are all helped if we have a basis of mindful awareness, mindful living, just being able to be present, even in those really stressful days when we're busy. You can still notice, gosh, there's a lot going on for me right now. I might need to take care of myself, or I might need to respond to this colleague differently, whatever it is. It's just a sort of moment to moment wake up and reconnection with what's going on right here, right now. Is that making sense?
Yeah, total sense. I think it's how you as a leader create that time to do that, and then make sure that you've given the psychological safety to your team to be able to open up and do exactly the same. I think that's what we're talking about here, isn't it?
Well, one example of that we've used in Action for Happiness for many years, all of our team meetings, whether it's board meetings with trustees through to day-to-day encounters, and indeed all of the local sessions that our volunteers run in local communities, we begin with something called the check-in, and it's got sort of three parts to it. The first is just having a pause, like we've all turned up busy, minds full, lots to say. Just take a pause and a breath and just reconnect. Then the next thing is you go around the circle, again, adapted depending on the timing and context, and each share one thing about how you're doing today. And that's a really sort of, as you were saying, needs psychological safety, but it's a really open opportunity to say, yeah, I'm great today, or I'm actually having a really tough time. I recently lost my father, and I was able to share with my team like how hard that was to be dealing with grief alongside everything else. And then the third point of this process, having created that sort of connection and that honesty, is to then choose to focus on something that's good. And so this combination of awareness and gratitude is really powerful. So I might have said, like, I'm feeling really sad today, and I'm really grateful that I had a lovely weekend with my family, or that I had a cycle to the office today, whatever it might be. And I think a core skill for happier living is this ability to hold two things in parallel. That life is tough and life can be good, and that today is stressful and there's something to be grateful for. It's not an either or. It's not some utopian wishful thinking. And yet we spend so much of our lives in that deficit mode, the negativity bias. We can really help by also having this moment to focus on what's good.
I really love that. I mean, that's such a beautiful, completely uncommoditized view of happiness, which is so different to what you see, as you were saying earlier, on Instagram and happiness being about acquiring and more and more and more. It's really about being very grateful for this very rounded human experience, isn't it? Where you can see the joy, but you can also hold some of the maybe the pain and the sadness. But those two things are sweeter in many ways because they are together. So I think that's beautiful the way you've described that. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I think you've summed it up beautifully then as well.
And that takes us really nicely onto something we were talking about before we started recording today, which is also something which really surprises me when, with all the different leaders we have on the podcast and that Paul and I work with through our day jobs, where so many leaders give themselves a really hard time. And there's this wonderful chapter in your book about taming the inner critic. And that really speaks to the imposter syndrome that we know that a lot of leaders have, and indeed many other guests that we've had on this podcast previously. Can you sum up some of your tips for how to deal with taming that inner critic for any leaders who might be really feeling that today?
Yes, I'd love to try to do that. And why don't we start by doing a little reflection? So, wherever you're listening to this right now, I'd like you to imagine that you're with someone that you love and they have messed up or let someone down in some way. They're really frustrated with themselves. They're feeling that they've made a mistake. And I want you to imagine how you would be with that loved one. What sort of words would you say to them? And what kind of body language would you adopt to them? And, what comes up for me is I'd probably say, don't worry, you're doing the best you can. It's going to be okay. And words to that effect, I'd be quite warm and encouraging. And now I'd like you to imagine that it's you that's messed up or let someone down or made a mistake. How would you talk to yourself in your head about that situation? Now, I can't speak for everyone here, but in my case, when I first did that exercise, I was really shocked to realize how rude I am to myself in my head. I call myself an effing idiot and effing this, and I'm really sweary, much more sweary than I am ever with another human being in my own head at myself. And I, for a while, thought that I was perhaps uniquely like that, and have discovered over the years that so many of us are really, really unkind to ourselves with our inner voices. We hold ourselves to unacceptably high sort of standards and really berate ourselves, or can do. And some of the discussion of self care appears to be quite sort of pampering. It's like self care is about having a warm bath and some scented candles and being really loving to yourself. And that's lovely. I'm not against that. But I think really self care's got to start with, let's talk to ourselves at least as nicely as we would to someone else that we care about. So I'm not going to necessarily pamper myself, but I might be able to say to myself, you're doing the best you can. It's going to be okay, and words to that effect. And so I ended up reframing my sweary F word in a sort of daily mantra, or reflection that I use now, which is more about how I would like to be in the world and how I think I am often being in the world, which is friendly, useful, calm, and kind. That's my rebranding of the well-known F word, as a sort of amusing way of reminding myself that I'm doing okay and I don't need to be so harsh on myself. But I think for leaders, all of us will have our own way of doing this. But just to recognize, how am I talking to myself? And to quote the words of Kristen Neff, who's a great expert in self-compassion, talk to yourself as you would to a friend. And that, for me, is the foundation of being a little bit less harsh on ourselves. Is that resonating for you?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, this is very timely actually because I'm very open on this podcast about how I go for therapy every few weeks. I actually saw my therapist yesterday, and we were talking about this very issue. And it's really quite shocking, isn't it, when you realise how harsh you can be to yourself in a way that you would never be with your friends and your family. And that's really quite wearing, isn't it? After and very counterproductive when you stand back and think about how you talk to yourself.
It is counterproductive. And the remedy begins again with that sort of mindful self awareness. Part one is noticing, gosh, that was a harsh way to talk to myself. And part two might then be, well, how might I say that as if I was talking to a friend? So, one way to do that is to say, imagine that someone you love is going through what you're dealing with today. So, whatever the stress and beration you're giving yourself in your head, imagine that was someone else you care about going through it. What would you say to them? And then say exactly that back to yourself with some conviction. So that's one way of sort of turning that friendliness that would go outwards back inwards. And then the other part is just to recognize this sort of common humanity, that all around us, there are other people dealing with this kind of stuff and probably being equally harsh to themselves in their heads. And actually, this is normal and it's understandable and you're not alone. And that sort of, for me, that disarms the whole thing. I can be a little bit calmer with myself. I can also probably be a bit more tolerant of colleagues and friends who might be behaving in slightly challenging ways, because they're probably bringing some of that inner critic with them as well. So I think this helps us with ourselves. It also is a bit of a foundational step for empathy and better relationships, which I hope is something else we might get a chance to talk about too.
It's funny because I've just we have two teenage boys, and something I remember about myself as a teenage boy, and something I see in them, is they're more open to expressing that inner critic. So whereas those conversations are in my head, when I might drop something in the kitchen and call myself an idiot, that's in my head most of the time. But particularly my eldest will vocalize it almost as a way of sort of exploring that out in the open. You say, well, that's not idiotic behavior or anything like it. You just need to sort of think about it in a different way. So I do wonder whether that's another thing that we could sort of look at our leaders to do, is to vocalize it, say it out loud every so often. When you're feeling that emotion, and as Zoe says, um, lots of our guests have talked about imposter syndrome in that way. Say it out loud. Be open.
I really agree with that. And kudos to your teenager. I have teenagers as well. And I think in various ways, they're more emotionally intelligent or more in touch with how they're feeling and able to talk about it than I think I was at that age. And on the point of leadership, we have this classical idea that leaders need to be strong and need to be sort of clear on their direction and need to be providing confidence and stability to the people around them. And yet, one of the most powerful ways of sort of revealing inner strength is to be more open about our struggles. And I think one of the greatest things any leader can do is to show vulnerability in appropriate contexts, taking responsibility and sort of saying, I'm really struggling with this right now. And this is how I'm hoping to respond. This is the help I need. You're modeling a sort of more authentic, human and sort of yeah, well, I guess as you're saying, you're letting out some of the inner noise, and that benefits others around you, provided you do that in a way that again maintains that psychological safety. That others think, "Gosh, well, maybe I'm now free to share what's going on for me," and it just takes that any kind of interaction. Sort of it deepens it from the superficial to the slightly more connected and real. And I think we like people and we are drawn to people who seem authentic and seem to be really able to express what's going on for them. In fact, we find it harder to build trust with people who always seem to be doing fine because if something doesn't quite resonate, we feel like we're not seeing the whole picture. So I think that's a really important insight that we might do with our friends and we don't do with our colleagues sometimes. And in fact, our work relationships will be better if we were be able to be more of our real selves. Again, keeping our professionalism, keeping our focus, but it definitely is possible.
Note to listeners, just concentrate on the language you use.
Indeed.
So that takes us very nicely onto mindset. And there's some amazing tips in your book about staying positive and calm and really cultivating that kind of mindset. And indeed, why it's mission critical to do so for yourself and the people around you. And we know there'll be lots of leaders out there going through many, many challenges at the moment, whether it's personal, whether it's professional. What would you advise them about how to really prioritize developing a positive and calm mindset at the moment? Because it's not easy, is it, with the state of the world as it is today?
It really isn't. There's so much going on globally and that we're more exposed to than ever before. There's a lot of challenges as a consequence of global affairs, whether it's around our financial circumstances, sort of polarization, disagreements, economic challenges, relational difficulties, in our personal lives, in our work lives. It's just a lot. So I think the first point about talking about making life happier is to recognize that this is not some unachievable utopia, that the happier is doing quite a bit of work there. We're not talking about some perfect end state. We're talking about making the best of life's journey, including all of its messiness and challenges along the way. And within that context, I still believe we can live a really meaningful, generally good feeling and connected career life and personal life, even in the face of dark times and big challenges. And to me, one of the key skills for doing that is it's really at the heart of, well, ancient Stoic philosophy at one level, modern cognitive therapy, and indeed, I would just say, good human life skills I'd love every child to learn in school. And for me, it's summed up with this ability that we have choice always over some aspects of what we respond to, and yet there will always be things that are outside of our control. And you may be aware of that famous serenity prayer. Gosh, I need to get the wording of this right now.
Is it this serenity to accept the things I
So it
cannot?
starts with to accept the things that I cannot change, the courage to change the things that I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. And with my happiness engineer hat on, I have a sort of flowchart version of that. But whatever's happening, we can ask ourselves, to what extent can I affect that and respond to that? And if it's outside of my control, it may well be best be outside of my mind or mindset for today's activities as well. And then if I can act on it, or even if it's only partially, well, it's much more agentic and helpful to take action in the area where you can make a difference or seek extra help or get extra information to identify what you can do. And I have a model which I share in the book, which is particularly around resilience in dealing with difficult situations. And it's captured by the acronym SHIFT. And SHIFT builds on modern cognitive therapy. Many people will be aware of CBT and model SHIFT. It's an acronym. SH stands for something happens, or as some of us might use another S word, happens, problem, an issue, a challenge. And what we tend to think is that what happens immediately is then how we feel and what we do in response to that issue, that challenge. And at the I of shift is recognizing that I am playing an intermediate role here with my interpretation. The I stands for interpretation. So when something happens, it doesn't immediately lead to certain feelings or actions. It depends on our interpretation of that situation. So, and then the F and T of shift. F is the feeling that then arises as a result of that interpretation. And the T is then the takeaway. What will I do about it? And so we might find ourselves saying something like, she made me so angry. And that's a sort of comes instinctively. But actually, when we look at the situation, we might say, well, actually, that's my interpretation of her behavior in that case that's left me feeling angry. I have a choice about how I've interpreted that. Maybe I could interpret it as like, she's having a difficult day. I may have the wrong end of the stick here. I don't necessarily need to feel antagonism. I could choose to respond or ask a clarifying question. And so, in any situation, whether it's a challenging conversation, an external stressor, a health issue, we've always got that I step, the interpretation of like, well, what am I bringing to this? What's my assumption? What's my bias here? What am I imagining is going on for the other person involved? And to notice that you have a choice. Now, sometimes anger and sadness or whatever these difficult emotions are may be the entirely appropriate response to that situation. But we have the opportunity to choose how we're interpreting it. And this is captured for me best by Viktor Frankl, whose amazing book, Man's Search for Meaning, described how he survived being in Auschwitz during the Holocaust. And his famous quote, or one of them is, everything can be taken from a man, or indeed a woman, but one thing, the last of human freedoms, the ability to choose one's own response in any given circumstance. And I just find that really moving and powerful that whatever's going on, we do still have a choice about how we interpret the situation and then what we do next. And that, in the context of world affairs that seem outside of our control, that choice might be to say, well, today, in order to be a good parent or a good colleague, I don't need to let myself doom scroll on this global thing that I have no control over. But what I can do is I can be here right now for this person who needs my full attention. And that is a conscious, wise choice in the context of a challenging world. Does that make sense?
Yeah, very much so, because it's about taking control of the things you can control, right? Because we can't control everything that's going on
Exactly.
globally, and that is, I think, a really smart response. To be honest with you, given that there is so much outside of leaders' control at the moment. I think what's really struck me when we talk to leaders, and also why your book is so important at the moment, is we know that a lot of leaders have been dealing with this ongoing cumulative stress and burnout from the perma crisis. So we talked there about global events. Obviously, there was the pandemic and all the economic and political challenges that happens and everything else that's going on. I thought your book had so much great advice about how you can keep yourself moving forward from difficult events, difficult challenges, or maybe bad things that have happened to you as well. What would you advise leaders who might be really feeling the weight of this terrible thing has happened, but I know that I need to keep moving on from it?
What a great question. I think it's probably worth going back to what I talk about as the basics in the book. And when I first started working in happiness and well-being, I got really excited about some of the sort of what you might think of as richer and more complex aspects about how to learn resilience and how to have a sense of purpose in life and how to, uh, you know, build trust and so on. And actually, we often forget the foundational sort of basics that underpin our ability to have energy, to be present, to make wise choices. And so for me, I talk about four of those in the book. The first is sleep. And actually, many of us, particularly when times are challenging, find sleep challenging. And we don't need to put ourselves under extra pressure there, but there are very, very specific, helpful sort of routine skills, which I don't think we need to go into now because I'm sure many leaders will be aware of them. But just having a sort of calming routine that allows you to restore and refresh. So even though I'm working incredibly hard at the moment, I'm still really making sure that the sleep is prioritized, and that we know helps us cope better in difficult times. And linked very closely to that is physical activity and the real strength that we get from getting out into daylight early in the day and getting those bright lights switched off late in the day, but also getting outdoors. And sometimes when we're under pressure and we're stressed, it's staying active is the first thing to go. And that, in fact, it's the one thing we should cling on to. It doesn't need to be necessarily be going to the gym or running marathons, but it could be getting outside, getting fresh air, connecting with nature. And for me, it's cycling. Cycling is my great joy, and I, whenever possible, go between meetings and commitments via bike. The third one, of course, is nutrition. And although I'm not a dietary expert, I have made lots of changes in my own sort of consumption to reduce ultra processed food, to stay hydrated more, um, to leave longer gaps between eating, lots of these things that are supposed to be good for our overall well-being and our gut and so on. And I've been really surprised how actually spending a little bit more time on sleep, movement, and nutrition has changed my mindset. So we think about resilience about being sort of great coping skills and so on, but actually, everything flows better when we feel that our basics are taken more care of. The fourth one is actually to do with our device use. The other great source of ill-being right now, and I think this is particularly true in stressful times, is the scrolling and the use of phones, and the algorithm is not our friend. It's designed to capture our attention, give us unhelpful dopamine boosts, and draw us away from what really matters. So I think having healthy habits around screen use and choosing how and when we engage really helps create that foundation. So for leaders facing stress, I'd say focus on the basics. And then I'd say recognize that we have this choice. And I like to make a choice to be what I call a realistic optimist, which is to say that, like, the world is awful. That's true. The world is better. That's also true. We've made huge progress in health and technology and social connection and all kinds of things. And the world can get better. And so all of those things are true in parallel. The world is awful in many ways. The world is better than it was in many ways. And we can make it better. And just recognizing that those can coexist then allows us to, again, use that interpretation and say, well, what can I do right now? I may not be able to change that situation that I'm really upset about. I'm really moved by the suffering in that other country. But what I can do is I can choose to amplify things that I see as positive and hopeful on social media rather than the opposite. I can bring people together to celebrate something we have achieved together, or put in place a project that really helps with a major local or global issue. But these are sort of constructive responses to a difficult situation. So I like this idea of realistic optimism rather than sort of wishful thinking, but it's action focused. And I can't state enough. I run an organization called Action Focus. I should have made this point earlier, perhaps, but we tend to forget that action changes how we think and feel more than thinking and feeling changes how we act. So we don't sort of think or feel our way into doing something. Start with doing, start with the next step forward, start with a friendly conversation, start with the inspiring, new idea, and the rest follows. The emotions follow, the cognitive processing follows. But even just a tiny step forward can have a remarkable impact, especially actually in those difficult situations.
I've just a small comment, but I called my business Excited By. There are reasons for it, but it's sometimes hard to live up to that, isn't it? You check yourself and go, I need to stick to this. I need to live by this doctrine.
Nice. Very nice.
And those small actions, they're so important, aren't they? I think that's the other thing I really took away from your book, that in order to improve your happiness and well-being, you can just start with really small things that shift your mindset.
Yes, you really can. And I like this idea of trying to be a happiness scientist in our own lives. And for me, that is, we're bombarded with all kinds of headlines about, cold water swimming is great for you, or join a choir and you'll feel better. And these are often based on studies. And that study might have an N number of 20,000 participants or 400 participants, but the only N number that matters is N equals 1, your own personal experience. So I suggest to people, look at the headlines, read the insights, use the science, but be a scientist and try it out in your own life. So, I tried high intensity interval training and it really hurt my knees. I tried joining a community choir and it did make me loads happier. And it's only through that experimentation. Oh, well, I couldn't stand cold water swimming, by the way. My wife loves it and it doesn't work for me. But I do love, cycling is one has really worked for me. But the point is, the general research is helpful, but the experience we have in our own lives matters. So I like this idea of taking a tiny step with an experimental hat on, like a scientist does, have a hypothesis, and it doesn't matter if it fails. If you try something, you're like, oh, that's not for me, that's good data. And then the happiness engineering, coming back to my engineering route, for me is then how do you turn the things that you have found helpful into habits that last? And there's all kinds of great wisdom, and I draw on people like James Clear and Professor Katie Milkman and so on in the book. But like, some of the top tips on building positive habits include If you want more of it, make it easy, like leave your running shoes by the door. If you want less of it, make it harder, like take the biscuits off the table in the meeting, and stop bringing cake in every day, and breaking habits down into simple changes, and then really celebrating when you do something. So when you or a colleague has tried something new and it's worked and you want to keep it going, it's great to go, oh, that was fantastic. Let's do that again. And we can help ourselves by not setting overly ambitious targets until a habit has formed. So instead of, I'm going to start meditating for 20 minutes a day, well, why don't we start with like, I'm going to start by taking 5 mindful breaths when my feet hit the floor as I get out of bed. And once I've mastered that for 2 weeks, then I can think about going further. But it's the sort of building something, engineering something into your daily life. You know, we brush our teeth every day. We've done that our whole lives, but if we give so much effort to our dental health, why are we not doing the same every day for our mental health?
Yeah, I really, really love that. To ask you about where the book ends up because for me, it ended up in a slightly unexpected direction, one that was really thought provoking. And I think absolutely right, which was about happiness and well-being as a collective endeavor and how we can all contribute towards a happier society with a bigger focus on well-being. And at the end of the book, you talk about helping the next generation thrive. So I was wondering if you could say a bit more about how leaders can do that and why it's so important.
Gosh, big question. How shall I tackle this without talking for half an hour? Well, first of all, the second half of the book is called Happier Together. And the most important point, really, for us all to be aware of is the world's longest ever study of lifelong health and happiness, run by Professor Robert Waldinger at Harvard, has found that the single biggest predictor of a long and healthy life is the quality of our relationships. We are a social species. So, this happiness quest is not an individual one only. In fact, caring for ourselves and caring for each other goes hand in hand and both support each other in really meaningful ways. So the whole second part of the book is really, how do I bring this into my relationships, the way I present in the workplace, the community, and also what I contribute to society beyond me. And as you mentioned, one of those areas is about the next generation. So I've got a chapter that talks about, I guess you could call it parenting, but really this is for anyone who has younger people in their life where you're trying to help build these skills for the future. And so I hope it's relevant to relatives with young people in their lives, to older colleagues looking after younger colleagues in some ways. And putting my parent hat back on for a moment, one of the most important things to recognize is actually a foundational relationship skill that we're not very good at in modern life, which is about listening to each other. And whether it is my teenage daughter or indeed my colleague at work, people want to be heard, not fixed. And so often in our relationships with each other, we jump to like oh, what you want to do is, or this is my opinion. And the biggest gift we can offer the world in our families, in our workplaces, anywhere is to pay attention and really listen to people. And the best way to do that is to sort of reflect back what they've said. And we can listen to people we don't agree with. And that doesn't mean that we're condoning their viewpoint or on their side necessarily. But the best way to disarm any conflict, any misunderstanding is to help the other person know that their point has landed. And then we're able to respond. So I love this idea of firstly recognizing relationships matter. Secondly, really tuning into our listening skills. Then when it comes back to this next generation point, have always felt that good parenting needs 3 things. And I think this is what we all need, really. We need sort of unconditional love. People need to know that they're really valued in and of themselves, regardless of their achievements or outputs. And we can give that to anyone in our lives, the fact that they matter regardless of what they achieve. Secondly, though, that love does need to come with some kind of like boundaries and some kind of like clarity. So as a parent in particular, love without any sense of sort of discipline or control doesn't necessarily do that child any favors. So it's about having rules. It's about having kind of age relative constraints over what is and isn't possible. And I think this debate currently, for example, about young people and social media use is fascinating because I have seen in my own teenagers that an early developing brain probably isn't best placed to be using TikTok or Instagram every day. I mean, it's probably true of us as adults as well. And then the third component that we all need is challenge. It's like, how do we help the people in our lives feel stretched? And I think sometimes when we think about happiness, we're thinking it's about like, oh, being kind and being gentle. And that's true. But actually, the biggest gift we can give to people we care about is to really encourage them to be their best and to stretch themselves. And of course, we can do that particularly as leaders with our teams. And Jonathan Haidt, the expert on social media and smartphones and the detrimental effect they've had on our lives, he says of children, but I think this is probably true of lots of us, we've not been protective enough over people's online lives, but we've been too protective over our real world lives. And we've got too many young people who are afraid to go out. Too many of us are sort of disconnecting from social situations. And I would say that part of that challenge that the next generation needs and that we all need is to sort of be encouraged to go out into the world, to take action, to take risks, again, with careful calibration of that and age relevant, but to sort of be willing to try and to fail and to learn. So I think that's the magic combination: unconditional love and appreciation, sense of sort of stability and boundaries, and a real encouragement to go out and do the best you can and contribute, knowing that if you fail or if you don't get the A or whatever it is that people might say is the target we're aiming for, that's okay because you're valued as a human being anyway. So do the best you can, but don't value yourself based on your achievements. And just while I'm on this wider topic of the greater good, kindness is a topic that is so often misunderstood and of course is needed when we're parents or when we're colleagues. And kindness for me is of course loving and soft and gentle, but it's also courageous and brave and honest. So like real kindness is being able to say to someone, I don't see it that way and I need to stand up for what I believe in here, or to call out behavior that's unkind or unhelpful and to stand up for causes that you believe in. I guess my main message from this message is we can't change the world, the whole world, but we can have a huge impact on our own lives and the world around us. This ripple effect that our behavior brings into every conversation, every opportunity. We can turn up with an intention to be warm, to be enthusiastic, to listen, to nurture, to encourage, to challenge sometimes, noticing that that energy we bring, that ethos we bring to our local lives, to our work lives, it really matters and it has this effect on others around us. It's been shown in studies to be contagious, that it will ripple not only to the people that we interact with, but also to the people they go on and interact with too. So this is like a really exciting superpower we all have to sort of spread ripples of realistic optimism, of listening, of generosity in the world around us.
Oh, an absolutely lovely note to end on, Mark. Thank you. I'm definitely going to be channeling your optimism and courageous kindness into my next meeting after today, and I'm sure Paul will as well. And what a fantastic way you've given us all in terms of your book and this wonderful conversation we've had the privilege of having with you this morning to think about what we can all do as leaders to really transform the world around us and really own that responsibility and privilege. So, thank you so much for getting us to think about our own happiness and well-being. And I'm sure lots of our listeners will be taking forward all of your tips and getting your book as well. So, thank you so much for a wonderful chat today.
Thank you both. I really enjoyed the questions.
Thank you. Some great tips in there. And I think we've just ended on shift, haven't we, by the sounds of it? I think something happened, this podcast, the intention behind it. And now I've forgotten what the F and the T is now. You have
Well,
to
I'm
fill me in.
feeling the F is feeling, and I'm feeling encouraged by this conversation. And the takeaway is let's go make this happen. Let's go make life happier. Let's take action and recognize that we can do that in our own lives and for each other around us as well.
There you go. Finished it well. Thank you very much.
Thank you both.
Many thanks again to Mark for joining us for a fantastic conversation and for sharing more about his book. I loved all the practical tips he shared, and I recommend the book to all of our listeners. I had a very enjoyable weekend reading the book not so long ago, and it really is worth having a read.
Yes, thank you very much to Mark. The conversation we recorded last week stuck with me throughout the week and the weekend. Lots to take away and put into practice. And thank you to him for all those hints and tips. As always, we really appreciate that you've listened all the way to the end of the episode. Thank you. You can support the podcast by leaving us a 5-star review wherever you listen. It genuinely helps us to reach more people. So if you found this episode useful, please do share it with a friend or a colleague.
Thank you so much for listening today. We will be back in a couple of weeks with another brand new episode of Starts at the Top, where we will continue to explore what it means to lead differently.
See you then, and bye for now.
Bye for now.